Welcome to the Roost News Podcast, the place for all things volunteer. Hi, I'm Curtis Springstead, your host for today. In this episode, we're going to talk with representatives of AARP in North Carolina and Kentucky about their efforts to serve and engage members of the rural communities across their states. In addition, we'll hear about the long history of AARP activity with this population and what's available today to help us engage with that community. Specifically, we'll talk about how they've leveraged the AARP's local rural work group in their efforts and outcomes that they've seen result. So to help me tell this story today, I have a number of people joining me. First, I have Alan Ormsby, State Director of Utah. Then Rosalie Calarco is an Associate State Director in the coastal region of North Carolina. And then Scott Wegenast, Kentucky State Communications Manager. And Mike Kulick is a Senior Advisor for Community and Field Support in the Office of Community Engagement, and as well as the lead of the rural engagement work for AARP's Office of Community Engagement. So thank you all for joining. I appreciate it very much. So like everything else, I think the best thing is for us to get a little background on AARP's history with rural community. And Alan, I think I understand you're probably the best equipped to speak to our long history in this area, and maybe help me out. What is exactly a rural community? How would I know I've got one?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the chance to be here. I love the rural work, and I'm more than happy to share some of the, as you said, long history. It's hard to believe that we've been doing this now for about 9 years. And let me start with kind of a definition of what a rural community is and looks like. So the U.S. Census says the definition of a rural community is basically any community that aggregated is smaller than about 50,000 people. So that means if you've got a city center kind of in the middle of, maybe a 30 or 40 square mile radius of that city, that whole group that kind of aggregates towards that city would have fewer than 50,000 people. A lot of people use what's called the Walmart test. Can you drive to a Walmart? If so, you may not be in a rural community, but if you can't drive to a Walmart easily, then you're probably in a rural community. AARP also thinks about those people who have rural affinity rather than just, the hard and fast rule of living in a community that's not within a city of 50,000 miles. It's people who grew up in rural communities and have now moved to big cities. They still have that affinity. They still have that heart for rural communities. And so, we think about it not only in the context of those hard and fast census rules, but who loves these rural communities? If you take just the hard and fast rule, about 19% of all AARP members live in rural communities. That's a huge group of people. We've got roughly 38 million people who are AARP members. That means about 7.5 million of those members live in rural communities. And I would dare say if you took that rural affinity, you'd have significantly more than that. Well, the history of the rural work really started in 2016. I think you remember in 2016, the election was not what anybody expected, right? We were not expecting that the rural communities of the United States would completely kind of shift their methodology of voting. And many of them voted Republican and voted for Trump in a way that was quite surprising for most people. We said at the time the rurals roared, and no one was prepared to hear that roar. At that time, the leadership of AARP said, we really need to get our finger on the pulse of the rural communities and find out what their needs and wants are that are different maybe than what our other members are confronting. And so at that time, we brought together a group from around the country, including some amazing volunteers who were really instrumental in helping us figure out not only the needs and wants of rural communities, but some of the specifics that are really important, like being a volunteer in a rural community is extremely different. You're on your own most of the time. You are, 300-ish miles away from a state office. Everything you do is going to be done in a way that is very independent. And so all of those needs that rural volunteers we tried to help identify that and then start bringing together some tools to really make volunteering in rural communities and impacting those rural communities in a deep way a greater reality.
That's great. I really appreciate that definition because, growing up mainly a suburbanite, I've just thought farmland. And now it occurs to me, even in my densely populated state, there's probably some rural communities and certainly in South Jersey, perhaps even a little to the north of me. So thanks very much for that help. All right, to make this all seem a little bit more concrete, let's get some real life examples of what people are doing and how it's impacting. So, Rosalie, maybe you can help us out here. So I think in North Carolina, you've been working particularly with veterans in the rural communities. Maybe you can speak a little bit about what you're doing and how that has evolved, perhaps, and what kind of impacts are you seeing as a result of that effort?
I certainly can. Thank you, Kurt and Roost News, for having us on to talk about our rural work. And I have the privilege and honor of also getting to do our veteran work in North Carolina, which for folks that may not realize it, 80 of our 100 counties in North Carolina are considered rural. So we are a rural state. Not just Charlotte and Raleigh-Durham area. We do have rural in our state. But one of the ways that we have really been able to utilize our Veterans, Military, and Families programming, which does our AARP members, the veteran population makes up about 6 million people who are members of AARP. So we do have a large veteran base of members at AARP. So we've been utilizing the resources that we have and the mission of that particular programming to reach our rural veterans, specifically by attending stand downs. In North Carolina, we do what's called a Veterans Benefit Live event where veterans can come to a specific location and get their veteran claims worked. But we are able to also then provide our resources that we have for caregiving, which is huge. One of the biggest resources that we have really gotten a lot of traction on is our Veterans Home Modification Guide, which is really great for folks in rural areas who are trying to age in place and stay where they are. It's helpful to those veterans be able to make the modifications that they need in their homes and stay where they are. So that's been a wonderful resource. The other thing that we do is we also try to attend some of the local DAV meetings, Vietnam Veterans of America, and give presentations. A popular one that we do a lot is our fraud for veterans because, like our older adults, they are also the next targeted group of folks who get scammed on a regular basis. So fraud has been a big area that we use as well with our veterans. And another way we've really been able to reach our rural folks is by doing teletown halls with our Veterans Healthcare and then the Veterans Benefit Administration, along with promoting one of our new resource guides. So when the Health Navigator came out, we did one for that. And then when the Home Modification Guide came out last year, we did a teletown hall for that. So we were able to reach more rural folks with that information. And then, because we have been attending these things, people have seen us and they've invited us to come speak to the North Carolina Department of Military and Veterans Affairs Veteran Service Office conference that they do on an annual basis, so that those veteran service officers then are familiar with our resources and can provide them to the veterans who come into their offices to get assistance. So we really try to utilize those relationships and collaborate so that we are a huge presence for our veteran community. And if you are staff or volunteer and you want to learn more about our veteran resources, you can go to aarp.org/veterans, but also the Veterans, Military, and Families Infonet page provides immense amount of resources for staff to engage with veterans as well. And this has been such a beneficial program for us. And North Carolina is ninth in the country for veterans population. So we are really trying to reach our rural veterans most importantly. So that is how we've been able to engage rurally, and it's really paid off dividends for us. So thank you, Kurt.
Well, that's great. I wish I'd known about this. My parents moved down there. My dad was a veteran. My brother is a disabled veteran. They both lived in rural areas of North Carolina. So I would have saved a lot of grief for some of them as they went through it. And my brother particularly took advantage of that housing you talked about. So I have a real personal connection with that. That's great. So glad to hear that that's working out. Well, in Kentucky, they're taking a slightly different approach to how they're engaging in communities. And Scott, you're with all the communications. I understand there's some regional collaborations that you folks have been working on. And again, tell us how that looks and what you're seeing as a result of that effort.
Good morning, Roost folks, and thank you for the invitation to be here for Kentucky. In Kentucky, we have 120 counties that are 120 total. Of those 120, 93 are considered predominantly rural. So our outreach, we recognize that same issue of how to connect with and engage and share some of the AARP resources in those counties. On the ground, we have had tax aid for many decades, driver safety. We also had chapters. As we saw those local chapters begin to diminish, we recognize the need to increase our outreach from the state office. One of the things that we've worked on for the last several years is a tremendous partnership with the Bluegrass Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Owensboro, Kentucky. And they received a community challenge grant in 2020 for $15,000 for starters. And they were able then to create an audio experience in the museum with these new active hearing devices that visitors could take out and go through the museum and have an increased experience. So the Bluegrass Museum has been just a terrific partner. We had a live concert that we streamed during the pandemic 2020 with them. That was a interesting challenge, but we were able to do it. Part of the outreach grew another engagement locally in Owensboro, and that was a community scam jam 2023. So then the launch for us, a big launch, nationwide, global reach, was a series of the Bluegrass Musical Virtual Experience. So we went digital. We worked with Brand Live and the Office of Community Engagement to produce a series of local concerts streaming from the Bluegrass Museum and Hall of Fame in Owensboro. So the Virtual Community Center helped us expand that reach. Bluegrass music has a global reach, and we engaged across 46 states with this broadcast and some international folks joining in. So we were able to analyze that data later on following the series. But they did a weekly show. One of them was really exciting. It was the Banjo Breakdown. And that was an incredible show. And fortunately, the Bluegrass Museum and Hall of Fame in Owensboro had produced video content for RFD TV and local broadcasts. So they had their own studio. They had the skills, the technology to produce this. So we promoted this series, and we included a sweepstakes offering free music lessons, free instruments. We gave away some mandolins and I think a banjo. So that really, I think, caught a lot of folks' attention. They got in the sweepstakes. They joined in the episodes, the 5-part series, and the kickoff concert was huge. So we were able to measure that digitally with, thankfully, the support of the Virtual Community Center. So that was tremendous. And then we built out of that the Scam Jams, where we talked about fraud prevention locally with folks. And the other activation in far west Kentucky, Paducah, home of the American Quilt Museum. It was tremendous. The outreach was, again, multi-state, nationwide. And we recruited new volunteers locally from the retired educators in that county, McCracken County. And they were able to help us reach out to folks during the American Quilt Society exhibit for 4 days. And again, we ran another sweepstakes offering some nice fun prizes, but we were able to share information and reach out to folks. One of the things that we concentrate on with our rural outreach are those 93 other counties that are predominantly rural. Daniel Rowe is our Associate State Director for Advocacy and Outreach, and he has been leading that effort for the past couple of years. So that has been a focus of our work in Kentucky. And I got to quickly mention, we had a tremendous activation at the Romp Bluegrass Music Festival in Owensboro, Kentucky. It was 4 days of nonstop bluegrass, contemporary music, and we had, again, recruited local volunteers. Some of those volunteers came in from the Ohio County chapter, and they were able to help us reach out from a tent. It was frightfully hot and sunny throughout the entire Romp Bluegrass Music Series. But that was sort of a test and learn, if you will, for us. We had good engagement, but it was so hot during the day. Folks would come out as the sun began to set. So the volunteers, again, supported that effort, and we reached several hundreds of folks. And again, we ran another sweepstakes, giving away some Yeti coolers to, 3 lucky winners. So we were very proud of all of that outreach, and we love doing our rural outreach. And we have some more outreach that we've done with the Community Challenge Grant in Appalachia and Pikeville. Has been a big part of how we've shown up in these counties and had real impact, I think, across those 93 rural counties in Kentucky.
That's great. It's a different approach of the way you've kind of aligned with the population and everything. And you give me a reminder I got to put on my travel list of another thing for me to visit when I go to Kentucky. I'll have to sneak in my interest in bluegrass. Don't tell my wife; she's not such a fan as I am. But I'm going to be there. I'm going to tell her it's a craft fair. That'll get her to go. So
there you go.
Thanks so much for that. It's really interesting. So at this point, I'm sure our listeners and viewers are starting to wonder, well, this sounds all very interesting, but how do I get started, and what is there to help me get launched? Mike, I think based on your title, you're probably the best one to give us an idea of what we can offer. Talk about the local rural work group and other resources that might be available. Why don't you kick us off of there?
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. And as everybody here today has mentioned, we really appreciate the opportunity to come on the Roost News and share with our AARP staff and volunteers and those in rural communities about what we're doing. And I think between Alan, Rosalie, and Scott, we've heard a lot of really strong supporting statements about why it just makes sense for AARP to spend the time and energy and funds, frankly, to invest in the rural work. I have been helping to co-lead this work for the Office of Community Engagement since the spring of 2023. Alan Ormsby has been leading this work long before I ever had it on my radar. And our former Vice President, Maurice Smile, came to me one day and was like, hey, Mike, at the time I lived in a small community, Puxatawney, Pennsylvania, small rural community, and said, you live in a small rural community. This could be interesting work for you to tap into. And I said, that sounds great. And the rest has really been, really wonderful for me to kind of, go deeper on with this audience. So we did form this work group. And, we really like to make sure that we are focusing in on community listening. So I would say to your question, Kurt, how can people get started with similar efforts in rural communities? We've done a lot of pilot testing at sort of a larger level in the Office of Community Engagement and funded some pilots, of one of which we're doing this year, which I'll talk about in just a second. But really, when it comes to listening locally, and this is something that we really advise doing for any community, regardless of size, but truly for rural communities, identifying those trusted messengers in the community, those local leaders, librarians, veterans groups, even county sheriffs, really, making sure that we're taking the time to say, what does the community want? Even if it's something that AARP shouldn't be providing or can't provide, we're still taking a point, taking a few minutes to listen to that conversation and either providing opportunities to get in on the ground level with other partners in the community or providing it outright on our own. And it really opens doors to the sort of that authentic engagement. 1 in 5, I think Alan had shared some statistics about, just how many people, how many AARP members are in rural areas. Nearly 1 in 5 AARP members live in rural areas. So that is huge. And we know that that number is probably only going to continue to grow as communities that are in some of these more metropolitan areas, people are able to telework. Like myself, I'm a full-time teleworker. I can work anywhere. And we're seeing that people are shifting and moving from some of the more populated, expensive areas and going into rural communities, provided that they have, broadband access and healthcare access and things like that. So we want to make sure that we're providing sort of the learnings that we've been able to call together as the rural work group with our states doing the work. Like obviously we have Utah, North Carolina, and Kentucky on here today, sharing some really great work that they've been focused on. But really looking at rural partners, I think I mentioned some, but really they're going to determine whether AARP sinks or swims in rural areas. Rural libraries, cooperative extension offices. Every state has a cooperative extension. And we recently just ended up finalizing our first cooperative extension playbook. So this is something that if a state wants to do focused rural work and isn't really sure where to start, we can provide them sort of with a blueprint to reach out to their local cooperative extension and say, hey, we've got a lot of alignment here with what AARP focuses in on social mission work with family caregivers and healthy living and other opportunities, fraud prevention, things that we know that our cooperative extensions, which are largely powered through these land grant universities, are able to say, hey, I think we can go out in community and combine forces. So we now have a playbook for that. So that's something that is available on our rural engagement toolkit that the OCE team powers, and I update that page. So states are welcome to reach out or have a volunteer reach out to their staff partner to get that extension playbook, and we can get that conversation going with you all. Rural libraries, American Legions, I know Rosalie touched on a lot of the great rural veterans work that we're going to be probably doing some more testing on around media buys in rural communities in the coming months. So just really focusing in on who are those key leaders, those partners, and a lot of times rural volunteers can guide you to the right people as well. So doing that internal listening, even if a team just has one volunteer, one person in a rural area, you have a strong footing to be able to start building a team around that person, finding community partners from that person. Trust is everything in rural communities. So I think that's going to be something to think about. And then something else, I think Scott touched on this, talking about some of the virtual programming that they've done. But virtual really does ensure that rural doesn't mean remote. So states should really just always be considering virtual programming as a core part of their rural outreach strategy, not just as a backup, but as a primary tool. We saw this in COVID when we were all having to sort of scale back and shut down our in-person programming and start doing 100% virtual programming for the first time at AARP. We saw that there were a lot of folks in rural areas that reached out to us for the first time and said, I've never heard of AARP wanting to be in my community, and you were able to, invite me to this virtual concert or this virtual event of some kind, and they then feel more connected to AARP. A lot of them have social isolation issues because of being in such remote areas. And so, whether it's virtual events, trainings, virtual town halls, there are ways that we can leverage our virtual tools like Brand Live, which Scott mentioned, Zoom, of course, which we're talking on today, or other types of tools that are out there. It really can make a huge difference in partnership with a lot of the in-person work that we're trying to do. And just kind of in closing, our local rural work group, which most of us are here. Daniel was not able to make it today, but he's been an integral part of that work as well. We are always open to suggestions from people who are doing this work on the ground, whether it's state office staff or the volunteers or community partners. We welcome people to reach out to us through email, Teams, carrier pigeon, whatever you feel like you want to use to get the ideas to us. Some of the really cool ideas that we've gotten a chance to say, hey, we'll put some money toward that. came from people that said, hey, I had a volunteer that had a really great idea. And one other thing I will mention, just because I know that they really have gone a long way with our Livable Communities team, and our current rural engagement team has been focused on these local impact funds for towns, or LIFT grants this year, which really takes small dollar amounts, and in this case, it's about $1,000, and says, hey, find a quick impact project, something you can do in about a year, and we'll fund it at about $1,000 to get that done, get that park bench finally created in that rural park, or get a shelf in a local library that we know that a key legislator cares about that library. Some of these little projects that, you might think at face value nobody's going to care about, a heck of a lot of people end up caring about it, and it really builds that trust for AARP and community. It gets us closer to a lot of legislators on both sides of the aisle, for the work that we're trying to do with our advocacy, both local and state, and really helps us to go farther. So we've been looking at the Community Challenge Grant Program, which I think I had written that down. Every year it gets a little bit more. This year, nearly 45% of our AARP Community Challenge Grant projects went to rural communities, which was about $2 million supporting 175 projects, the largest AARP investment in rural grant making to date. And so the Office of Community Engagement looked at that and said, let's see if we can kind of go a little deeper with that. So we're working with 10 state offices across the country in their rural communities to do quick action turnaround grants with these LIFT grants that we're doing. So we have a lot of learnings that we're already taking from that. And I have no doubt that that's another, idea for a state office if they want to think about how they're able to actually get started. Sometimes just having $1,000 from your state budget is all that it takes to really start making inroads in rural communities. So there's a few ideas for you, Kurt.
Okay.
I really enjoy working on this work, and really it is our AARP state offices and volunteers that make it go and create that impact. So it's great to be able to work at the national level and help to support that.
Well, it certainly seems like there's a lot. I should take the concern about being a pioneer perhaps in your state to try and do it. Seems like a lot of navigation's been done for us. We can borrow and learn from other people's experiences. Just while I have this august panel here, anybody else have any other insights about launching a program? Things you learned. Maybe finding that first point of contact in a county or in a community or something, whatever it might be. Any thoughts from any of you?
Curtis, I'll just quickly say those county co-ops and those local libraries, they have been tremendous partners, as well as your retired educators out in those counties.
Absolutely.
That's a great starting point.
Okay, excellent. I think, Alan, you were saying?
Yeah, I was just going to say, find that key volunteer, find that person who has been, a part of the Rotary Club, a part of, the Lions, whatever group is kind of important in that rural community. Find that volunteer who is the connector, the person who knows everyone and everything in that small town. And man, you've got some real opportunities there, because they're going to know, as Mike said, those little $1,000 projects that are out there, they're going to know which ones are going to be the most impactful, and really listen to your volunteers.
Okay. Yeah, it's certainly been my experience. I've done some other work where if we can find somebody who already has a network where we're trying to go, we can just pile on top of that. And frankly, they're usually more than happy to have a little extra assistance. They've been going it alone for so long. That's great. All right. Anything else? I want to make sure we didn't leave any questions unanswered there that you guys wanted to share, but I think we've given a lot.
I'll just add, sorry. I was just going to say, just please, if you're listening to this or watching this, just think about the importance of listening locally. Lean on us as the rural work group. We're here to help, and just start small. You'll be really surprised how quickly momentum builds when you meet communities where they are.
Yeah, I think you're right. Figure out how to answer a question that they're already asking rather than tell them a question they may or may not be interested in, right? Very good. So listen, thank you all for sharing your experiences and efforts with the rural population. Frankly, I'm in the end of the state that's not rural, but I got a few things I'm going to take back and talk with the people I'm engaged with. So thank you very much for that. And I want to thank our audience. We encourage you to subscribe to our Roost News podcast channel on YouTube or listen to the audio versions on your favorite podcast platform. And of course, please invite your colleagues to join us too. And on behalf of the Roost News podcast team, we thank you.